All he needs is a friend. Those are the words that always stuck with me when my grandmother described her childhood. Growing up in the Soviet Union provided its own set of challenges, but that was never what she described as really making an impact on her life. I mean, don't get me wrong, she grew up during a tough time, but of all the insanity that she had witnessed in her life, the one thing that stood out to her was a creature known to her village that came to be known as the Koresh. She, like many people and villagers in the USSR, lived near a large wooded area, and the one rule that she could recall as a kid was to never go into the forest late at night. "The bears are the least of our concern," her mother would always tell her. "The most terrifying thing you can encounter is a friend." Of course, being a young child, she had no idea what her mother had meant, and when she pushed her for details, she was always told that she'd understand when she was older. But there was no point in giving her nightmares when she was still so young. Naturally, she tried to ask the other villagers what her mother was so worried about, but none of the adults were willing to speak of such evil to a child. She had all but given up her search for answers when one of her cousins approached her one day. "You want to know about what lives in the forest?" he asks while smoking a cigarette. "Of course I do, Alec," she said, a bit excited. "But how could you know what's out there? Neither of us is old enough, according to my mom." He coughed and flicked the still-lit cigarette onto the ground, stomping on it as he talked. "I heard the adults talking about it one night. They seemed really worried about it making its way to the village." "Why would they be worried?" "Apparently it's not any animal. It's more of a thing. But from the way they described it, it sounds pretty human. They say it takes people who go out there. Well, some of them." This piqued her interest. "Some of them? Why only some?" "Don't know. They mentioned something about leaving friends, whatever that means." "Friends? Like its name?" He shrugged. "I'm just as curious as you are, which is why we're going to go find out exactly what it is." Even though she had no idea what was out there, she couldn't help but feel a deep sense of terror at the thought of meeting what stalked those woods. "Tonight?" she asked wearily. "Yeah, tonight. I know where my dad keeps his hunting rifle. He's a heavy sleeper, so I should have no problem sneaking it out. Whatever's out there, I'm sure a couple of rounds to its skull would keep us out of danger. Can meet you outside your home. I'm going to come late, though, so just make sure that you're up." Despite the feeling of unease, she still trusted Alec. Though he was a few years older than her, they had grown up together and the two had developed a close bond. She also knew that he had often gone out hunting with his father and that they would likely be safe so long as they had the gun. She nodded her head and told him that she'd be ready by the time he came over. Deep into the night, she laid awake in her bed. Her parents had long gone to sleep and she was up contemplating what she would see that night. As the hours passed, she grew worried that Alec hadn't been able to make it out of the house. She slowly crept out of bed and walked outside with a flashlight, softly closing the door behind her. She flashed into the darkness and almost jumped out of her skin when she saw Alec standing in front of her with a hunting rifle slung over her shoulder. "Jesus!" she half yelled, punching him in the chest. "You almost gave me a damn heart attack." "Sorry, I thought you knew I was coming. Didn't expect you to be out here looking for me," he said with a laugh. She shook her head and asked him what the plan was. "Well," he started, "from what I overheard, if you build a fire and sit around it for long enough, he'll come to you, which seems simple enough. Apparently, if we just have a normal conversation, he'll want to join in." A look of confusion crossed her face, and then it quickly turned to annoyance. "I thought you were being serious about this. We have a conversation? How stupid do you think I am?" "What?" he asked, confused. "I'm being serious. What makes you think I'm not?" "That sounds far too simple. If something's out there, there has to be more to find than it just talking, right? Why would just talking draw it in?" He shrugged, simply said that's what the adults had mentioned. The survivors of the thing had all simply been camping or had gone for a walk with friends. Nothing else in particular was mentioned as a reason for drawing it. Slightly discouraged by what was beginning to sound more and more like a hoax, She still agreed to go away to satisfy her curiosity. At the very least, if she got through the night without seeing anything, she would know that the legend was nothing more than that, a legend. And she could sleep peacefully at night with the knowledge that the adults really didn't have anything to worry about outside of your run-of-the-mill animals. They made the hike out of the woods and stopped at what seemed to be a random spot. Alex set up a campfire. She sat down in a nearby log and looked up at the sky. "Do you really think we'll find anything out here?" she asked. "Forest is a big place. How do we know we'll find it right here?" "Remember Igor? Supposedly this is a spot he saw the thing when he was on a hunting trip with some friends." "Did they shoot at it?" "No. They ran like cowards. If we see it." He picked up the rifle and aimed it into the woods with a big smile on his face. "We'll shoot it. Bring the body back to the village. Maybe we'll actually get some respect from the adults if we kill the thing." She nodded and put her hands around the fire, just as it roared up. Alex stood up and said that he had to use the bathroom before walking behind some trees. However, it only took a few seconds after he had disappeared for him to come rushing back to the campsite. "I found something! Quick! Put it by the fire so that we can read!" Confused, she quickly got up from her spot and went over to him. He was crouched by the fire looking down at a piece of paper, and she read from over his shoulder. From what she could see, it looked like a set of rules that read: 1. Accept gifts. 2. Don't run. 3. Don't scream. 4. Don't insult. 5. Be happy. 6. He is your friend. 7. Come back to visit. "What the hell?" Alec asked with a trembling voice. "Where did you find this?" she asked. "It was pinned to the tree I was pissing on. What the fuck do they mean? He's our friend? That sounds stupid, right?" He promptly stood up, crumpling the paper, and then threw it to the ground. "It doesn't matter. After this night's over, the friend will be dead." At this point, her trust in Alec was beginning to waver. At first, she had confidence in him, but now she wasn't too sure. Not only had a group of grown men almost all disappeared, but they specifically left behind a message of how to deal with the thing because they knew it was the only way. How smart was it really for Alec, who was still only 16, to claim that he could defeat this thing when they obviously couldn't? She waited to ask if they could go home, but she knew that he'd insist on staying, and she didn't feel comfortable walking back alone, so she opted to stay quiet. She found a spot on the opposite side of the campfire. Alex sat on the ground and set the gun beside him. The two were silent, the moment providing too much stress for both of them. Despite his prior bravado, it took a few minutes for Alec to finally break the silence and start a conversation. At first, it was awkward, neither knowing what to talk about or how long until they could expect the thing to show up, but slowly it became warmer. They started to reminisce about their childhoods, what it was like to grow up in the village, and what they wanted to really do as they got older. They shared laughs and exchanged jabs, and before they knew it, they had simply been talking for hours. By the time they realized it, Alex stood up and yawned. "Maybe it is just a myth. Come on, let's go." Confused at why Alex had stopped mid-sentence, she took note of the look of sheer terror on his face. Tracking his eyes, he appeared to be staring at something directly to her right. My grandmother looked to her side and saw a lanky, white figure taking a seat on the log next to her. Her blood ran cold at the sight of the thing. The fire had the unfortunate task of illuminating the creature. A 6-foot-tall abomination with porcelain white skin looked back at her. It had an oval, elongated head with a large scar running down the middle. Its eyes were small, shallow circles that looked more like sores than anything that could effectively perceive movement. Its mouth was literally as wide as its head and filled with rows of needle-like teeth. Its body looked emaciated, and on its right arm, it looked as though it had another limb that started to grow. Instinctually, Alex screamed in terror, and the thing immediately snapped its head toward him. It quickly stood up and reached over the fire with elongated arms and picked him up by the head. He cried as it had him in its grasp, and its eyes, which at first were no bigger than a dollar coin, suddenly grew to the size of baseballs. With one swift motion, it crushed his skull in between its hands, casually dropping his body into the fire before sitting back down next to my grandmother. Its mouth curled upwards to reveal teeth in what she could only recall as a distorted interpretation of a smile. Every fiber of her being wanted to panic and run, but she knew that would mean instant death. It took every ounce of strength she had to not cry over the gruesome death of Alec and to force a smile. "Hello," she echoed out. It stared down at her, still smiling, and all she could do was try and smile back. Just as she was about to break, the thing stood up and walked into the forest. As soon as it was out of sight, she began to break down. The tears flowed, and she wailed into the night. The realization that her own curiosity had led to the death of her cousin, hitting her with a force unlike any she'd ever come to know. She didn't get the chance to grieve for very long as she suddenly heard rustling from behind her. She quickly sat up, wiped away the tears, and choked back any sobs that had the chance of escaping her mouth. Putting on the fake smile again, she looked back and saw it dragging something. When it stood next to her, it dropped what looked like a wolf carcass that had been completely picked clean of hair, with its teeth pulled out. It looked down at the gift, and then back at her. Her fake smile widened, and she very reluctantly bent down to touch the thing. "Thank you. This is very kind, but I'm a small girl. I have no way of getting this home." It continued to stare at her, unsure of whether or not it understood. She wanted to demonstrate that she couldn't lift it. After several minutes of struggling, it simply picked up the dead wolf with one hand, then pointed back towards the village. The thing walked a few yards ahead, then stopped to turn around and stare at her, maintaining that terrible smile. She got the inkling that it wanted her to follow, but unsure of whether or not it actually wanted to take her to the village, she hesitated. She eyeballed the gun for a moment, but realized that she had no training of the firearm. And even if she could somehow get a shot off before it grabbed her, there was no guarantee the bullet would do any real damage. Reluctantly, she decided to follow and keep a somewhat comfortable distance. By the time the sun began to rise in the sky, they had made it back to the village. It tossed the carcass onto the ground, and then turned to my grandmother. As she walked past it, making sure to keep her now painful smile, she thanked it for walking her home. And to her horror, it started to make a gurgling sound in response. Saliva started to drip from its mouth, and after several seconds of it trying desperately to choke up words, it managed to grunt out the words, "You're welcome." Then it simply walked back out into the woods. She stood there in shock. The way that creature had said those words sent another wave of guilt and panic through her. She collapsed to the ground and cried until some villagers came by and brought her to her parents. There she told them about everything that had happened. She sobbed about how the thing had killed Alec, given her the carcass, perhaps most terrifying of all, how it had sounded exactly like him as it had left. From what I understand, the villagers told her that they had sent parties to kill it before. That every time they did that, there were no survivors. The most they could do was put the sign back up. Let anyone unfortunate enough to meet it know what they should do if they happened to come across it. The answer to surviving was simple. All he needs is a friend. However, there was one more rule my grandmother had to follow. Every once in a while, she had to make the trip back out to the woods. She had to sit and wait for the thing to come out of hiding, and speak with it until it decided it was time for her to come home. It never got easier, of course. The thing that had killed her cousin made her blood run cold at every time she saw it. It wasn't until she moved to the United States did she finally feel free of that creature, content that it could never follow her here. But that's not where the story ends. See, our family owns a cabin where the town used to be. I'd never visited, but after my grandmother had told me the story so many times as a kid, I don't know, I feel like I kind of have to see it through, right? Spend a few weeks there, see if I find anything. If I do, then I don't see why I wouldn't be fine. If all I have to do is show it kindness, then it should be fairly easy. Plus, it can't follow me home, even if it is real. My flight out to Russia is set for next month, so I guess we'll see what happens. I'll keep everyone updated. Hopefully. Hey there kids, it's me, Mr. Creepypasta, and I just want to make sure that all of you guys are still staying safe and doing your best to stay inside and keep yourself quarantined if you can do so. For those of you who can't, really appreciate you guys doing what you have to do. So, all the best to all of you who are still working, and all the best to all of you who are forced to kind of stay home and are not able to work. If you guys are missing out on a lot of the conventions, which at this point, all of them that I was planning on going to this year, with the exception of San Japan, looks like have been either canceled or pushed back. If you guys were looking forward to any of the conventions this year and are missing out on a lot of the artwork from some of your favorite authors or artists, take a look in the description down below. At least until the quarantine is over, you'll be able to find links to a bunch of my artist friends as well as authors in the description of every video. And of course, I will be bringing you guys stories every single day from now until the end of time, available here on YouTube as well as here on the podcast on Spotify, Apple, iTunes, and Google, and wherever else you can get podcasts. And now a very special thank you, big thank you, the biggest thank you I can possibly give to all of you who support on patreon.com/MrCreepypasta, who help keep the lights on in my house. Patreons such as Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Ken Lando Higuchi, Brianna Van Tine-Janzen, Chompski, TheRedOakShieldVirus, Sindee Barney, G. Weevil3, Diana Kraus, Stephen VanHuss, Tristain Pelton, Nico, kaeo, TheGingerBroz, Dante Rowe, Raphael Rodriguez, Lastbladesong, Eliminator86, Nebsky, SteampunkSinner, Kaleb Dougal, Daniel Poulsen, Sky Harbor, The Homeless Bird 93, Gabrielle Undefined, Barbie Carmen, Liam Newman, Aaron Stormcrow, Dr. Strawberry, Barbara Masio, Thomas Burgett, Azazel Rotten, Let's Get Scared, S-Man, Brandy Hasanori, and King DDD. Thank you guys so much for supporting on Patreon, as well as all of you that are shown in the description down below. And sweet dreams, everyone.